So chapter 8 begins with an interesting note that I think is often overlooked in the church, that Jesus is actually being accompanied apparently by a number of women. It's not just 12 male disciples. What do you make of that?
It's hardly noticed. I mean, people just flash over that and they don't stop to think about what are the economic problems of running a ministry like Jesus. I mean, for instance, we know Peter's married, has a family, and Jesus has invited him to leave his fishing. So do we really think that Jesus is going to leave the family destitute? So, it's important that some people believe in Jesus and what he's doing enough to cough up the money to keep the mission going.
Mm-hmm. And that's what these women, a number of them seem to be doing, is supporting him financially?
That's what it says. Yeah. All at once, why do we question the book? I mean, I question it a lot, but people who don't ever want to question the book never seem to get to this passage.
But I thought if you wanted to be a true disciple of Jesus, you're supposed to give away everything you have.
Right. I mean, that's what is common parlance, I realize, yeah. To one rich guy with a real hang-up, he says that. So now that one we make blanket. Not that anybody pays attention.
Yeah, I mean that really it boggles my mind to think to just remember that Jesus' whole ministry, really there wouldn't have gone off the ground unless there were actually people, and people of wealth too, who are actually supporting this.
So we have huge prejudice in our time, and probably every time, against certain groups. One of them are rich people. And the liberal church is very, very down on all rich people in most of my memory and time. And the statements that are made are, constantly are almost unconscious, the put-downs. But how many rich friends did Jesus really have? I mean, Levi was rich, we know. Zacchaeus was rich. Joseph of Arimathea was rich. Nicodemus was rich. Mary Magdalene was rich. All the people just named in the beginning of the 8th chapter. I mean, it's not Jesus doing the discriminating.
Yeah. I want to clarify too, when you say liberal church, we're talking about an in-house arguments with with that. We come from the perspective of not from a conservative fundamentalist standpoint, pointing fingers. We're talking about our church.
Oh, I wouldn't say anything nasty about anybody except my own people, because
yeah, exactly.
I have to love my enemy.
Absolutely. So now we move on. He's got this interesting story about the parable of the sower, and it's kind of hard. This parable, where it's like, where are we supposed to identify in this parable? Are we seeds, or are we soil, or where do we find ourselves in this parable?
Well, you mean if you pay attention?
Yeah.
We aren't the seed, and we're not the sower, so we must be the soil. And the parable asks us, what kind of soil are you? Yeah. But it's also the beginning, in a sense, the best introduction to the whole category of parables, which I think is huge.
Mm-hmm. Say more.
Well, most people I run into, myself included, to begin with at least, was that Jesus told parables to get truth down onto common levels so everybody could understand it. But Jesus himself says that's absolutely not true. I tell parables to confuse people. And I think what he's really saying, though this is dangerous, I think what he's really saying is, I'm telling it in parables so that people who aren't patient, who don't want to dig deep, explore, will miss it. And some of that's, I think, maybe kindness, so that, parables are hiding spiritual truth. And if people aren't ready for it, they'll really wreck themselves. So I believe that Jesus is telling parables, and so one thing I absolutely believe, if you get it right off, you know you missed it. Yeah. Because, among other things, Jesus is the most brilliant man who ever hit this planet. We forget just because he's Savior and Son of God doesn't mean he's stupid. But we often act like he's kind of simple-minded or a little slow, or doesn't like people keep saying he's not practical. I mean, what kind of effrontery? Do you really think you're brighter than he is? I mean, not you, but we tend to think, well, he's a little unrealistic. He doesn't know what he's talking about, or he missed that. He doesn't understand. So, the parables are incredibly deep And I don't need to go on from there. It's just that I hope as your folk are going through these studies, every time they hit a parable, they say, fasten your seatbelts
Right.
and dive.
Yeah. And part of that diving, I think, also involves throwing ourselves into the world of the parable and thinking about scenarios, you kind of finding them in our everyday lives, and which may lead also to scenarios that aren't even mentioned in the parables. I think we'll come up with that later too. But I know as I think about the parable of the sower, I mean, I'm no farmer, and so I don't. I'm in Nebraska now, but I'm no farmer, and so I'm not as familiar with farming. But I do have a garden it's outside my house here, and I'm more familiar with potting plants. And I'm also no green thumb, but I do know that with potting plants anyway, it reminds me of Jesus' talk about the seeds that go in get into rocky soil. I mean, the roots go down, then they stop. They don't have the depth of the soil, and that's what we have to do with plants. If you put them in a pot, you eventually have to move them to a bigger pot if they're going to grow. And just the process of doing that, you're pulling it up out of its comfort zone. You're then messing with the roots and really making it quite uncomfortable in a sense, and then putting it in this larger pot. And it seems like such a spiritual principle. There is that God is always kind of moving us into a larger and larger pot, and that may be well and wonderful, but it doesn't feel so good.
At first.
At first, it feels like I've just been uprooted, and now you're even messing with my roots that are hanging out and dangling and vulnerable, and it reminds me of that scene in one of the Harry Potter films where the replanting of the mandrakes, and how they're in the greenhouse, and they pull up these plants, and they got these little beings that are like the roots, and they come out and they just scream to high heaven. And how often in the church, when we go through periods of change, you kind of uproot a church a bit to put it in a larger pot, and you hear like this, and I think we have to kind of be discerning of when we hear the screams and from the repotting that takes place. Is that are the screams coming from people being malnourished, or are they coming from growing pains? If they're screaming from being malnourished, then you need to say, well, what are we doing wrong in our ministry? I think, or how do we need to change to bring nutrients in? But so many times the screams seem to come from the growing pains.
You mean because they don't want to grow?
Right.
Yeah. So new wine goes into new wineskins, and we go into larger pots.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And
I think I got it.
Yeah. Maybe it's not even that we don't want to grow, but we don't want to grow and have pain associated with it. I think everybody wants to grow, most of us, but we don't want pain. Yeah.
Or change.
That's right. So moving on. Now, there's this interesting piece about Jesus and Mary and
his brothers.
And his brothers, yeah. Are they not close, or what do you pick up in this story of this encounter with Jesus and Mary?
Well, number one, I pick up that if you are really a faithful Christian, you will never have any trouble in your family.
That you will never have any trouble in your family?
Only the Son of God did, so. But that's not widely advertised, is it? Yeah, so a man's foes will be those of his own household, and it's stated in John point blank, even his brothers did not believe in him. As far as we know, neither Mary nor the brothers ever were part of the earthly ministry. They apparently were afterward, but not during the earthly ministry. So Jesus was having a lot of trouble. What I really pick up is not a lot of anger toward them. I think that especially Mary was afraid for him. She thought, you're getting into more and more trouble, and she didn't want him to be hurt. Nevertheless, she got in his way, and he would not put up with it. So Jesus would not put up with it, which reminds us that we do have that issue or that problem, which he reminds us about a lot. It's easy. I know many, many men who seem willing to follow the faith or the path until it displeases their wife or their children, or of course a wife who won't displease her husband, and that's idolatry. There come times when, to be faithful, you have to disturb your own family members, and I think that's what Jesus is making very clear. I didn't come to being priest, but a sword, to set a man against his father, mother, wife, children, etc. That's very, very hard to hear. but it is essential.
With all the talk about family values in society, I sometimes wonder, and raised by Christians, I sometimes wonder if Christians are actually acquainted with Jesus' family values, and if they were, if they might re-crucify him for it.
And then, so much in this chapter we got to move on, but the Gerasene demoniac, how much can we say about that? What makes most outstanding from my perspective at the moment, I hope the groups are going to go through that story with a fine-tooth comb, but this is the only person I know of in the whole story who wants to come with Jesus, who wants to give his life and be a disciple, and Jesus turns him down. That's another thing they never taught me in Sunday school. No one answer is ever right for everybody. And when I make a statement like that, I'm going to get an hour's worth of discussion on and even some upsetness with most groups. But I hope your groups are much more mature than that.
Yeah, and to me, it just follows the part of that pattern of Jesus. It seems to be sending people away, or they're not. He's not asking them after he heals them. He's not saying, "Now that I've healed you, come with me." Again, that attempt not to control people, and I would imagine a mighty fine church arose then by leaving him behind, perhaps anyway.
And I think people then, after I make a statement like that, they assume I'm trying to say that Jesus didn't care, and that's not at all. I think he had more wisdom than the demoniac and realized this is not going to work, and you have other things to do that will. So, yeah. And then the tail end of this day is pretty incredible with Jairus' daughter. He can't get. He tries to go an R&R, runs into the demoniac. Then he goes home and runs into Jairus' daughter and the woman with the hemorrhage. And what do you make of all that?
Well, I think it's fascinating. Your comment in your commentary that maybe we should be taking Jesus at his word. Jesus says she's not dead.
Yeah, but who's going to listen to him?
But who's going to listen to him? Yeah, it reminds me of that Monty Python piece about the bring out your dead, and that one guy who's not really dead yet. They put him on the card anyway. And he's like, I'm not dead yet. Well, you're mighty sick. Well, I'm feeling better. No, you're not. But maybe Jesus is actually to be taken seriously here. And it reminds me also of Acts 20, and when Paul apparently does a very similar thing. The youth falls out the window because he's fallen asleep while Paul is preaching, and people assume him dead. But is it possible actually that he's not? That same kind of thing happening.
And another surprise, certainly for me, was this woman with a hemorrhage, 12 years now. I have to get into the place and time. So she is a hemorrhage, she's bleeding, and blood is serious business. And she has no business being in that crowd. She is supposed to quarantine herself because she doesn't know, and then nobody knows what's wrong with her. We don't have medicine like we do. So she has no business being in a crowd. She has no business touching him. That's the one thing she's not supposed to do. Against all Torah, against all cultural rules. She is way, way out of line and knows it. And that's why she's being so secretive. And then Jesus, in compassion, rounds on her and says, "Who touched me?"
Right.
And won't leave it alone until he drags it out that she's the one, and everybody in that crowd knows she is being, she's going against all the rules. But so after you get through figuring that all out, you realize, well, he's healing her on 2 levels. I was only expecting 1.
There he goes again, breaking those rules and encouraging others to do so as well. Watch out for this Jesus guy.